Okay, so in this lecture, we explore the role of taxation and forced labor in the establishment of colonialism, focusing on the Dutch colonial state in Indonesia. And I'd like to make two key points. First, taxation and forced labor played a pivotal role in shaping colonial states and their and governance, but for more broader reasons than we may expect. And second, colonial taxation was very complex and difficult. Colonial officials struggled to organize the tax administration. They often relied on local indigenous structures of social organization to shape it. And this then allowed colonial taxpayers to influence how, in practice, taxation unfolded. So the lecture explores the evolution of Dutch colonial fiscal policy, focusing on the transition from forced labor to monetary taxation and the inherent tensions between colonial ambitions and realities. But first, I would like to discuss taxation's broader implications for state building and governance. Taxes glue societies and states together. They provide stable revenue, enabling states to operate on financial markets to generate funds for infrastructure, healthcare, and education. Taxes both furnish and demand intricate administration and bureaucracy for surveillance and can be used to influence behavior. Think, for instance, of excises on cigarettes or fossil fuels. Additionally, taxes foster dialogue between subjects and states to determine how tax money is collected and spent. Hence, in European history, new taxes were often accompanied by new voting rights and the birth of nation states. Without durable fiscal systems, states, bureaucracies, and public participation would not have been possible. While colonial states relied on external power rather than internal approval and denied subjects participation and heavily exploited them, they should not be overlooked when exploring these pertinent issues of governance and state building. Modern colonial states showed similar concern with population management, with administration, economic growth, and even public welfare, which in reality could impossibly be reconciled with their exploitative nature. Simultaneously, historical tax systems were quite different from what we are used to today. So, for instance, in colonial Indonesia, only men were taxed and held responsible for presumably their wives' incomes, and colonial states imposed different taxes for different population groups, which were usually racially classified and separated. But as the majority of present day states have inherited their tax systems from former colonial powers, this is really worth further investigation. And importantly, as Indonesia will show, lack of representative democracy in colonial states did not mean that mechanisms of deliberation and negotiation were fully absent. So, to understand taxation in 19th and 20th century Indonesia, we should start with its roots, which were laid by the Dutch East India Company, or VOC. Operating across Asia, the VOC began levying taxes in some of its acquired domains and established extensive plantation systems, for instance, in Java and the Moluccas. So let's zoom in on these regions. The Moluccas were home to important spice trade, which the Dutch monopolized around the 1650s through violent conquest and political strategizing, exploiting all sorts of local rivalries and alliance making with indigenous rulers. In the Banda Islands, the Dutch established Caribbean-like slave plantations for the cultivation of nutmeg after brutally murdering and displacing most of their original inhabitants. In Ambon, the Dutch settled contracts with village leaders, forcing them to produce cloves exclusively for the VOC. And the chiefs received shares and rewards based on production quota and were partially integrated into the VOC's administrative structure. And this really became the VOC's basic operational method. In Java, we see something similar. So the slow embroilment of the VOC in local politics led to a partial Dutch conquest of the island and cooperation with local elites to deploy existing state systems and sedentary rice cultivating peasantries for the production of cash crops like tea, sugar, and coffee. The VOC went bankrupt around 1800, and its territories in Indonesia were reformed into a colonial state under Dutch rule. Initially, the Dutch pursued enlightened policies of free trade and monetary taxes, but due to financial crisis, reverted back to profit-oriented monopolism and forced labor. The Malaccan spice monopoly was broken, so focus shifted to Java, where the Dutch implemented a cultivation system, essentially continuing the monopolist schemes of the VOC. In a nutshell, this cultivation system demanded peasants to collectively produce cash crops and render these to the Dutch, who claimed monopoly rights on the export and sale in Europe. Locally, the system was organized by co-opted indigenous rulers and chiefs, as under the VOC system, and these chiefs shared in profits. A similar cultivation system for coffee was also imposed in West Sumatra in the 1840s. The systems rendered enormous profits, contributing massively to the Dutch treasury. Alongside forced cultivation, the government also imposed various compulsory corvée services for the construction of infrastructure, government buildings, and other activities supporting the state. Here too, the Dutch tapped into existing patron-client relationships and customary law. Claiming sovereignty over Java, they appropriated existing services and duties that peasants traditionally performed for their landlords, their chiefs, and for the Javanese nobility. Peasants were expected to perform an annual 66 days of these corvée services, but these came on top of many informal lordly services and village duties, which were also eagerly exploited by the Dutch. Some of these services were paid, enabling peasants to pay land rent. This was a tax levied on yield based on land value and imposed in 1811. Though land rent made significant contributions to the colonial treasury, its value was structurally surpassed by that of forced labor in the 19th century. By levying services and land rent, the Dutch could dominate important aspects of village life. Together with forced cultivation, the semi-indigenous services became a refined form of colonial exploitation and control. This was legitimized through various discursive colonial accounts about the alleged economic immaturity or inefficiency of indigenous people. Forced labor was presented as a disciplinary force that promoted labor ethics and provided what colonial officials then called tutelary guidance to reorder society. Now, ironically, the problems in indigenous society as observed by the Dutch were actually often the result of colonialism. So, for instance, Java's villages transformed into these overexploited, stagnating entities ruled by corrupted chiefs, as observed by the Dutch, only under the cultivation system, which the Dutch then subsequently captured in stereotypical tropes of native society that then justified to them further colonial intervention. However, following critique from liberal statesmen in the Netherlands on exclusion of free trade and heated debate about the cultivation system's disruptive effects and its feudal character and the overexploitation and extortion of peasants, the monopolies in Ambon and Java were lifted and forced cultivation was gradually abolished from about 1860 onwards. The colony opened up for private entrepreneurs and the export economy grew, driven by all sorts of new products like tobacco, rubber, coal, tin, and oil, sourced primarily outside of Java, which induced a rapid Dutch colonial expansion across Indonesia between 1870 and 1920. Simultaneously, colonial officials became increasingly motivated by evolving liberal ideas and awkward developmental ambitions, partially driven by concerns for their responsibility for indigenous well-being after the problematic effects of forced cultivation. Herein, the introduction of direct taxes played an increasingly important role. Now, like other colonial powers, the Dutch expected their colony to be self-sufficient. Taxes were levied to fund local colonial administrations to prevent the need for the contribution from the motherland. The costs of administration in Indonesia rose, but by 1870, few people in fact paid monetary taxes, as the colonial state was supported by monopolies, sale of resources, and forced labor. So, to ensure the contribution to state finances by newly arriving European entrepreneurs, the government swiftly imposed income and property taxes for these population groups from 1878 onwards, despite much protest, followed by many other taxes for other population groups. Taxing indigenous people, however, proved quite a bit more complicated. Indigenous people had far smaller and often unknown incomes and were far more abundant and diversified than Europeans. Taxing them group-wise in labor, as it happened before by levying these services, had been very effective and efficient as it required relatively limited administration. But forced labor became seen increasingly as feudalistic and not fashioned and in conflict with this idea of a more modern, responsible colonial state. So between the 1860s and the 1900s, the Dutch felt compelled to start converting forced labor services into monetary taxes. In Ambon, the forced production of spices was replaced by a collective village tax in 1863. It was paid by chiefs and later converted into an individual head tax. Similar head or poll taxes were also implemented in Java after 1880 in replacement of forced cultivation and corvée services. Initially, peasants were allowed to buy off their services, for instance, at a fixed price of, say, a guilder per day of service, which was then made into a more permanent regulation that prohibited services and obliged monetary tax payment. As a consequence, the colonial tax system absorbed the customary law systems that traditionally coordinated these services, many of which again were rooted in traditional indigenous duties which had been appropriated by the colonial government. Furthermore, taxation and customary law basically concerned the same things, like income, property, social duty, status, and redistribution of these. So it is actually quite logic that they ended up in conversation. The government launched a series of investigations into customary law and ultimately concluded that in Java, in general, access to land was what determined liability to perform services and pay taxes. Now, as a result, taxation became a game of using indigenous customs to determine and prove peasants' landholding positions. And here too, officials and indigenous tax collectors were pivotal as they were the only ones that had sufficient knowledge of customary law, which was highly local, and also the local authority to address landholding and to levy taxes. This dramatically enhanced the power and status of these chiefs, while landholding became increasingly a financial risk in some places in Java. In 1900, the Dutch launched a so-called ethical policy, which re-centralized welfare and developmental ambitions in the colonial administration, basically to mask the dramatic effects of continued colonial exploitation. Its supposed aim was to uplift or modernize indigenous people to what the Dutch saw as European standards, with tax payment as a crucial aspect to define modern subjecthood. And this was also to enhance the state's own credibility as a supposedly modern state upheld by taxes instead of services. Now, beyond Java, officials focused on integrating all inhabitants of the colony into the expanding state and tax system to shift the burden from the Javanese to other subjects and ensure that all contributed equally to the state, but also to assert state presence in these regions. That way, taxation became a tool to integrate people into the state's administrative structures. For instance, tax receipts also served as a proof of identity. Officials argued that monetary taxation would stimulate monetary income earning, and modernize indigenous economies and bring order and peace. So, ironically, the Dutch seem to have believed that making people pay for their own occupation sort of helped subjecting them. The ultimate goal here was to arrive at a uniform modern tax state where every colonial subject contributed equally. And taxation that way became serving various purposes: to enforce state order and bring the state in contact with people, to improve control of the state over revenue, to enhance the bureaucracy, to instrumentalize local customary law, to reorganize society, change the behavior of subjects, and ultimately create obedient tax-paying subjects. A governor in Java called this the educative cogency of taxation that made everyone consider themselves citizens of the state, as he described it. By 1900, the system of all these different head and income taxes across the archipelago and all these different taxation regimes for different population groups had become rather disunified. For instance, Chinese people were classified as a separate ethnically defined social legal group, inelegantly termed foreign Orientals. So these are non-Indonesian Asians, and they paid different types of taxes. Furthermore, in many areas, indigenous taxes had been pawned out to so-called tax farmers who leased the right to tax in name of the government in exchange for shares in its revenue. However, in a supposedly modern colonial state, such practices were no longer allowed. So the Dutch tried to reclaim control over all these taxes, and then they began merging all these various tax arrangements for Europeans, Chinese people, and all the different indigenous population groups across the archipelago into an overarching tax system, arriving ultimately at a unified income tax in 1920. However, though meticulously detailed in its design, this 1920 unified income tax appeared to be highly impractical. It attempted to grasp numerous spatial and social differences that in practice couldn't really be bridged. and it was criticized as such from its very inception by many officials as being motivated and presuming some kind of unified colonial society that existed only in the minds of theorists in the Netherlands. Many field officials felt they had little governing capacity to begin with. For instance, upon learning about the imminent introduction of the unified income tax in 1920, Victor Korn, a colonial administrator active in Bali, wrote, "When going into the village, I see hundreds of poorly dressed Balinese sitting around me, all listening, unmoved to their assessments of 1.5 to 2 guilders. Even if I knew their incomes, where would I find the time to assess 250,000 people and calculate their assessments?" So, how then did the Dutch operate in practice? Well, often they relied on local rulers who, akin to the supervision of forced labor before, were entrusted with the administration and collection of taxes under the oversight of European civil servants, and sometimes even personally held accountable. In return for their cooperation, they typically received an 8% collector's wage, solidifying their position within the colonial administration and entrusting their further cooperation. Consequently, much of the tax system's functioning remains unknown to the Dutch and invisible in colonial archives. But what we do know is that indigenous structures were often left intact. These indigenous structures really dictated how taxes were assessed and collected, while the chiefs, contractually bound to execute colonial governance and taxation, reported whatever their European supervisors wanted to hear, simultaneously taxing at their own discretion. So Dutch structures of indirect rule required a minimal and very cheap state apparatus, but further empowered all these local elites who had an interest in withholding resources and information from the center. This rendered the pre-colonial social, legal, and political footings in which forced labor and taxation became rooted largely uncharted and unregulated. As a result, while use of government purvey in Java reduced, other services continued, and outside of Java, many chiefs kept levying services, which really was the form of state-supported extraction over which they held most discretion. Many people preferred to perform labor duties instead of paying tax, for instance, due to limited availability of cash. Here, local officials often turned a blind eye as the welfare policies that were announcing the ethical policy of the 1900s involved many new projects that required much labor power. Though the average amount of labor services levied per capita decreased from 52 to 20 days of labor between 1854 and 1928, in 1929, over 11 million individuals in Indonesia, or about a quarter of the total indigenous population, still performed forced services of some kind. As emphasized by the prominent Indonesian nationalist Haji Agus Salim at the Forced Labor Convention of the International Labour Organization in Geneva in 1929, corvée services remained an irresistibly cheap and convenient form of labor supply, especially in resource-rich frontiers, of which Indonesia had many. So it appears that all these high-flown modernization ambitions and ideas really stood little chance in practice, where the circumstances under which new taxes were implemented overshadowed the ideas, laws, and precepts motivating them. In fact, outsourcing the tax system to local elites allowed adaptability and responsiveness to local methods and customary law, surpassing rigid state ideologies. Such local methods were unwritten and therefore more adaptive and flexible and negotiable, and they often provided better answers to local challenges than theories and principles framed in government offices. Negotiation practices as such were copied into the colonial tax system. Thus, in Indonesia, the tax payment procedure involved a big gathering, a tax gathering, in which villages were allowed to object against their tax assessments. They would take the opportunity to, as particularly one civil servant remarked, to sketch in detail their scantiness of incomes and weakness of limbs, and to tell of the diseases, calamities, and hardships that made it difficult, if not impossible, to scrape together the essential daily needs and to pay taxes. That way, he wrote, indigenous taxpayers managed to bargain with the colonial overlords, using colonial appropriation of their customs against them. So through taxation and resisting against it, indigenous subjects actively tested the limits of Dutch colonial power, which was, while perhaps stronger than that of some pre-colonial rulers, not unlimited. The feral presence of the state in some spaces left room for competitors who recognized the importance of taxation for state building. For instance, in 1920, people in a small village in the island of Seram in eastern Indonesia refused to pay their taxes. They had been recruited by members of an Indonesian nationalist party and told that paying the party membership fee exempted them from paying taxes. Some conclusions. So, colonial Indonesia exemplifies the pivotal role of taxation in lofty government ambitions to reshape society, with taxes serving as instruments of surveillance, development, and control. Colonial plans to introduce direct taxes echoed civilizing rhetoric, referring to state building practices similar to at home in Europe. Naturally, tax practices in Europe differed from those in colonies, but not just because of the authoritarian and exploitative nature of colonial governance, but also for its limitations in building administrative capacity and constructing proper ties with the population. Dutch colonial officials relied heavily on indirect rule and local cooperation. Taxes were managed by local rulers and tied into indigenous customs and social political organization, which compromised the European precepts of the tax system, but also made it more flexible and practicable. Colonial taxpayers in Indonesia adeptly negotiated their fiscal positions, challenging the assumptions of colonial power holders. So the case of Indonesia underscores that governance, even in colonial contexts, is often shaped by disputes between states, intermediaries, and subjects over fiscal issues. Taxation here serves as a platform to encounter, deflect, and contest the state in this gray scale between coercion, resistance, and voluntary compliance.